Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the Sarasota Bay Deep Dive series, where we interview people whose work has positive impacts on Sarasota Bay. My name is Darcy Young. I work with the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program here in Sarasota, Florida. And my guest on today's Deep Dive broadcast is Stevie Freeman-Montes, who is the Sustainability Manager with the City of Sarasota. Thanks for joining me, Stevie.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is exciting. It's my first Facebook Live, so this is fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm glad to be your first Facebook Live. So can you tell us a little bit about your role at the city, the different programs that you and the Sustainability Office manage at the city?
Yeah, it's a unique role, so I always like the opportunity to kind of explain what my job entails. So my title is Sustainability Manager, and we're located in the City Manager's office. And really, when I think about what we do, I categorize it into typically 4 different buckets, and it's climate change work, energy, waste reduction, and then education. And we do projects and policies both for our own city operations. When you think of all the buildings and vehicles and kind of us as a business unit, our internal operations, how we can be more sustainable and lower our environmental footprint related to those issues. And then we also work on community-wide planning and like external projects under those same themes as well. That's the short version.
Great. I could tell you've given that synopsis before.
Well, everybody's like, sustainability manager, what is that exactly? I think.
Right. Yeah, you cover so many different realms, but the one that we're going to talk about mostly today is your work on climate change.
Yep.
And you and I have been working on this together for a few years now with a bunch of other organizations around the region. So I'm excited to have you on today to talk about it. And so I wanted to kick it off with the City of Sarasota was one of the first local governments in Southwest Florida to conduct and adopt a climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what those are and why they were important for the city to do and why the city took that step I think it was in 2015 when the assessment came out. Is that right? Or when it started?
When it started, we adopted it in January of 2018. But yeah, oh my gosh, I was hired in 2015, and one of the things I was hired to do when I started here was to kind of work on climate change issues, and it was very broad. And so one of the first things we did out of the gate is to try to use some of our BP oil spill funds, Deepwater Horizon local claim funds, to get help and get assistance with a climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan. So that's a very long title, but really what it was, the purpose of it was to identify exactly where we were vulnerable to future climate projections for sea level rise, storm surge, extreme precipitation, and heat, and where our city-owned assets, like the infrastructure that we own, where we were vulnerable, prioritize those vulnerabilities, and create high-level adaptation solutions or options for them. And the reason why we went through such a detailed and holistic planning process is because the city really provides important critical services for the community. And I mean, I think maybe that's obvious to say, but when you really think about drinking water and wastewater treatment and our roadways and keeping stormwater off of our evacuation routes and, all these things that the city provides, there's so many infrastructure, the nuts and bolts of how to deliver those services are really important to plan well for. So the city kind of knew that, hey, we need to get better up to speed on climate change projections and how we can make smart upgrades and decisions now so that we can be resilient into the future. Because, like, for example, our wastewater infrastructure, when we upgrade one of those assets, that's maybe a 75-year, $10 million investment. And so it's really critical to understand the most up-to-date science related to climate change and build in a way that, makes us resilient so that our city can maintain its quality of life over time. So anyways, that was the whole point of doing it initially. But I would also say, just on the side, I think another reason why we did it was we wanted to become more comfortable with scenario planning and what that was all about. And for us, that was everybody wanted to know exactly how much sea level rise we were going to have in that certain date. Everybody wants to know, pick, the number, and there's a lot of uncertainty with the science based on what trigger points we're going to hit. And so how do you make decisions as a government based on that uncertainty and that scenario? There's ways you can do it. There's definitely, and we embarked on this planning process back in 2017 was when we did kind of the majority of it, so that we could be more comfortable using scenarios and climate projections while making big city investment decisions.
Great. Yeah, I think you hit on so many of the important parts of climate vulnerability planning. It's not just about the document that you get at the end. It's about training your staff to become more comfortable with these terms, thinking in terms of these projections, much farther, maybe planning horizons than they're used to. And I love what you said about, getting comfortable with uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
I think a lot of us are getting comfortable with uncertainty now in a way we haven't before, but but I think the city's, that planning document is a really elegant way of showing that. So I'm wondering, okay, so the adaptation plan was adopted in 2018. Can you give us any examples of how the city is implementing and using the plan today to make decisions about how the city works?
Yeah. Well, so now the results of that plan, like I mentioned before, are these prioritized vulnerabilities. So we have existing infrastructure and assets that are prioritized and we know need to be kind of upgraded sooner rather than later. So once we have those priorities, we've been able to kind of make sure that those are addressed through many different channels of how our infrastructure gets upgraded. And for example, some of the vulnerabilities we identified were transportation issues or roadways that were actually going to be upgraded by the state, by the Florida Department of Transportation. So those locals who may be well aware of our roundabout projects that are going along on 10th Street and 14th and US 41, and that are planned at Fruitville and at even Gulfstream and the going over the bridge in the near to midterm. We were able to show our priorities and what we found and make sure that those were addressed in their projects and in collaboration with them, because it has such a important impact to the city of Sarasota and our residents. So that's just one example, but we also have our own city-owned kind of capital improvement planning process that we make sure if something's a vulnerable asset, we are taking into account what the adaptation plan identified. But another one that I'm really proud of is that we have just an ongoing seawall repair program at the city. We've got so many public seawalls that just get in disrepair and need to be upgraded. And one of the unexpected outcomes of doing the adaptation plan was that now when we replace a seawall because it's in disrepair, that's a public seawall, we don't just replace it with another seawall. We actually do a site assessment to see if it can sustain, or if a softer, more climate-friendly, resilient shoreline can be installed, like a living shoreline or a hybrid shoreline for habitat benefits, and they're more resilient to sea level rise. So before, we would have just replaced a seawall. And now within another city kind of process, we assess each site to see if we can do a living shoreline or some sort of softer solution. So long story short, what I think has been the biggest way that we've moved the climate adaptation plan forward is integrating into other city processes to make sure climate considerations are considered, because the city has so many different functions. Each department kind of has their own micro level of planning, really detailed level of planning. So our Parks and Recreation Division has their own master plan that they started. And they started with looking at our climate vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan and making sure that they were addressing upgrades related to the vulnerabilities that were identified. And same with our transportation master plan. They were getting really detailed in our transportation master plan, but they started with where we left off with in a way with our climate adaptation plan. So it's been important we have applied for grants. We have looked at our vulnerabilities and applied for grants to actually do the upgrades, but simultaneously we've worked really hard to integrate into other departments' planning processes and just general upgrades so that we can make sure that things are addressed over time.
That's really fantastic that you've been able to make those connections with the other departments and ensure that communication happens so that this isn't just a plan sitting on a shelf, that it's being used. So much work went into it, and it's such a good plan. And it's exciting to hear that you're, working on some of these implementation projects, and we're going to talk about those a little bit later, I think. But before we get there, I want to talk about another part of what you do with the Sustainability Office that's related to climate change, which is looking at greenhouse gas emissions in the city. And so the city inventories these greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to what we call kind of the heat warming blanket of climate change, right? Can you give us an overview of the major sources of emissions in the city that you found through doing these inventories?
Yeah, I'm glad to get to talk about that part of our work, because I think lately the climate adaptation and kind of how we're addressing future conditions and sea level rise and those types of issues get a lot more attention. But I think it is important to highlight that we and a lot of other community organizations work on what I call mitigation or reducing our greenhouse gas emissions as well, so we don't hit hopefully those worst case scenarios. And so we do greenhouse gas inventories in our office. We have data from 2003, 2007, 2015, and 2018. So it's great to have that span of, over the years of data. And I actually knew that we were going to talk about this. So I have a couple slides here that I can show the sectors. I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay. And see how this works. See if it works all right.
Okay, you ready?
Is it showing?
Yep, I see it. Looks good.
Okay, awesome. So this is just one data point here where you can see from 2003 where our greenhouse gas emissions were, and then where we're at in 2018. So it's a significant reduction. Yeah, and a lot of people may be surprised by that, and I'll kind of tell you why it is, or what we found at least. And then this next slide is just, sorry, the formatting came off a little weird on this, but you can see transportation emissions are one thing that we look at, and that's really from tailpipe emissions from vehicles driven in the city. And there's certain estimates we have for how we calculate that, and then there's certain good amount of data points. So, there is some uncertainty to it, but we have good protocols that we follow based on, national best practices on how we come up with that estimate. But 35% of our local emissions is from the transportation sector and local tailpipe emissions. And then you have 20% from the residential energy. This is both electricity and gas use in our homes within the city boundaries. And then commercial and industrial energy, which is gas and electricity, is 37% there. So I like to kind of think of residential and commercial together, which is, 57%, because those are our buildings, whether they're residential or commercial, they are our buildings. And then you have our waste from our solid waste that's sent to the landfill at 8% there. So I just thought I'm a visual person, so I wanted to show just kind of the piece of the pie here and how that works. I'll stop sharing here. And then
I have a quick question before you move on. I wanted to think about that residential and commercial energy together again. So are those examples of things where we're using the energy here, but the way that energy is produced, the emissions might not be happening within the city of Sarasota? Is that a correct way of putting it?
That is definitely the correct way of putting it. So the way that we calculate greenhouse gas emissions is based on a very a protocol that all cities have to follow, and they divide them into scopes 1, 2, and 3. And scope 1 is like the transportation emissions, which are local emissions. And you kind of report those differently. And there's a lot of different ways to splice the data, but this is the kind of high level version is transportation emissions are what's called scope 1, whereas scope 2 emissions are like the residential and commercial energy, where our demand for that energy is causing that electricity to be produced and kind of emitted into the air elsewhere, but it's our demand. We have a responsibility related to that, but it's categorized differently because the where the electricity is produced, it's their scope 1 emissions, right? So there's all these different ways of kind of reporting it to make sure that things aren't double counted, but it is very clearly, though, technically it's released where the power plant is located for our electricity emissions, for example.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and it has impacts on the way we think about things like local air quality and water quality as well. So those local emissions from the tailpipe matter a lot more for those local things than necessarily the emissions from buildings, but all of it matters for when we're talking about climate change mitigation, right?
Right, exactly. And to go into a little bit of the decrease too, we were really surprised ourselves because as we were going through it, and I'm going to publicly call out Jeff Redenberg, who has actually done these greenhouse gas inventories for the last 2 years. Yeah, for 2015, 2018. He's probably sitting there being like, I'm probably not even getting it right when I explain it, but he's in the weeds of all this. And I'm sure he'd welcome an interview to explain it and just talk about this stuff, because he's such a data heavy on these things. But for comparing 2003 to 2018, for example, for just energy use, if you look at the amount of, for example, kilowatt hours our residents and our commercial businesses used is one piece of the puzzle. And you definitely always want to reduce your kilowatt hours of just electricity being used. But then there's something called emission factors of the power that we're getting from the grid. And FPL, Florida Power and Light, is our investor-owned utility. And compared to 2003 to 2018, they have dramatically improved their emission factors of the power that is sent to the grid. And that made a huge difference in our local emissions. In 2003, they had a lot more coal and oil. And now they have natural gas, and they're moving dramatically into renewables and more solar as well. So we expect for the emission factors to be even better. But that played a huge role in our greenhouse gas reductions, just our utility grid emission factors, and also our waste, our solid waste. Where we send our solid waste is the Sarasota County landfill, and they've installed a methane recovery based on the landfill. They capture the methane and generate electricity. And when they installed that dramatically, I think it was like over 60% or of our emissions from waste were reduced because the methane was captured and no longer released into our local atmosphere. So, there's been some positive changes in short in terms of how we as a culture and society are moving forward.
Great. Yeah. I didn't realize the reduction from the landfill was that much. That's great.
Yeah.
So can you tell us, do you have a sense of what sectors we need to pay more attention to in terms of reducing emissions? And is there anything that people who live in the city of Sarasota, people who visit, that we can all do to help reduce those greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, I think in our local greenhouse gas emissions, where we could improve is our transportation emissions. And I think that there's a lot of complex things that go into that. A lot of it may be equity and what people have, where they're able to afford to live and where they are able to get a job. And so that has to be an important part of the discussion. in terms of solutions. But I would say as a city, helping improve walkability and bikeability is what we are trying to really focus on through our Sarasota in Motion and Transportation Master Plan. Mm-hmm. I think that helping our city be as pleasant as possible and as safe as possible to walk and bike is really game changing for our transportation emissions. And I think that the COVID-19, the pandemic and the quarantine has really highlighted some of these issues on transportation. I don't know about you, but I started seeing people walking around my neighborhood that I was like, where? I've never,
who are you?
Who are you? Where, you know, I've never known. And I think people were going further and just, you know, because there was nothing else to do. And so realizing how far you can walk and how a streetscape and shade trees and all that play into it. Anyway, so I think that that's really something that we can continue to invest more in as a city, is improving our walkability and bikeability and making things safe. And then also electric vehicles are less in terms of the tailpipe emissions that they produce. And so as a city, what we can do for electric vehicle charging station to make it an easy option for folks. And then, yeah, I mean, I think then it comes down to personal behavior and what people, you know, can do, and then what they choose to do when they are able to. And I would just encourage people to, you know, carpool, bike, walk. If you're able to use an EV, all those types of things are great things to do. And then I forgot your last question. I think it was, what people could do. Well, besides what I just mentioned about transportation, I think weatherizing homes is still a really important thing to keep on the forefront of the conversation. It's not as attractive sometimes as some of the other solutions like solar or something, but energy efficiency, especially with some of our older homes. I live in a 1925 home, so I get it. It's tough. But I think as much as we can encourage that, and people could help weatherize and upgrade their homes. And food, that was another one that I wanted to mention, because we didn't capture food in our greenhouse gas inventory, but it is a large contributor to global climate emissions. And so, you know, a plant-rich diet is, you know, definitely very climate friendly.
Great, Stevie. I want to zoom back out a little bit. And while I do that, I also want to invite our audience to chime in anytime with a question that you have about anything that Stevie's been talking about so far. But I want to zoom back out a little bit to that kind of residential and commercial emissions, because the City of Sarasota signed on a few years ago to the Ready for 100 initiative. Can you talk about that initiative and how it kind of factors into thinking about the city's greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, the Ready for 100 initiative started with community members. So I always have to call them out, because we had a huge group of residents who just packed the city commission chambers and asked our commission to commit to 100% renewable energy. And it was really, really citizen driven. I was actually quite scared of the initiative eventually, because I thought, how feasible is this? How do we know the feasibility going into it? And so you know, they really took the lead and pushed us based on what they wanted the city to pursue. And the city commission in 2017 committed to 100% renewable energy by 2045 and 100% renewable energy for city operations by 2030. So community-wide by 2045 and for city operations by 2030. And that was great, but what we did is that set the vision. That set that this is where we want to be, and and we call this initiative the Ready for 100 initiative. And so we began over a year, maybe a year and a half long planning process with community members, where we had workshops every 3 months, I think it was. We had workshops, and we said, okay, everybody came to the city commission chambers and you asked us to commit to this. What are your ideas for reaching this 100% renewable energy target? And we gathered ideas, and then we said, how do we want to evaluate these strategies? We wanted to be sure we prioritize strategies that targeted low-income household and historically marginalized groups. We wanted to make sure we prioritize strategies that had local job creation potential and that had co-benefits of climate adaptation. So we kind of created with community members in these workshops how we were going to grade the strategies that were identified, and then we graded them. We kind of prioritized them, and that essentially created this, what we call it, the Roadmap to 100 report that was very grassroots driven. It was really a lot of citizen input, and just time went into the community involvement aspect of it. And I think that was really great. And we have this strategy. I think we need to do a little more of the technical analysis side of things, of how each strategy will help us reach that goal. But one thing that I struggle with the name Ready for 100 and the 100% renewable energy initiative is I always want to try to communicate that we prioritize energy efficiency and reducing energy first. And I think sometimes it's 100% renewable energy. So you might think that we're only advocating for solar, for example, but we definitely are prioritize strategies underneath the umbrella of that initiative that were energy conservation and energy efficiency strategies, so that we could reduce as much as we can, be efficient with as much as we can, and then whatever is left over, use renewable energy and support renewable energy for that.
We have a question from Karen about the Ready for 100 initiative. Karen lives in Manatee County. They're in the early stages of putting together that scary citizen initiative. Ready for 100. She wants to know if their plan is ready for review so that they can pick up some tips from the City of Sarasota.
Yeah. Hey, Karen. Shout out. I'd love to see some names I recognize. Yes, it is on our sarasotafl.gov and then dash sustainability. We have a Ready for 100 subpage on our website that I'm pretty sure has the Roadmap to 100 plan on it. If not, definitely email me. I know, Karen, you have my email, but for others that may be watching that don't, it's at sustainability at sarasotafl.gov, and I can definitely email you the Roadmap to 100 report. But I really am passionate about this initiative, and so I've talked with some folks from Manatee County over time, and I'm always welcome to share any lessons learned or resources that we created along the way through the workshops, and would love to see the initiative pick up there as well.
And while we're on the topic of resources, Stevie, is there a good place where people can go to learn more about weatherizing their homes? That can be kind of a complicated topic.
I hate to punt this one, but I would recommend people go to Sarasota County UF IFAS. They do so much amazing work in this space, and I talk to them weekly on different efforts that they work on, but they have, I wanted the opportunity actually to brag about one of the Sarasota County programs. I'm with the City of Sarasota, but I really support and wanted to call out a Sarasota County program, which is the Energy Upgrade Program. And that provides weatherization for low-income housing units here in the city. So this is a great program that we really support, and has been supported by the Branson Foundation, and we've had they've had different partners with the Sarasota Housing Authority. But right now there's an open window for Sarasota County's Energy Upgrade Program for volunteers that are needed, and these volunteers would get trained on weatherization upgrades and water saving upgrades, and then those volunteers would go into low-income housing and actually perform some upgrades and also do some education. And it's just such a phenomenal program. So if anybody's interested in volunteering, I think it would help you in your own home too, because you'll learn how to do weatherization for these housing units, but you'd also learn how to do them for your own home and in your neighborhood. So that's if you Google, I did this before we got on, Sarasota County Energy Upgrade Program, that'll pop up for you.
Yeah, that's such an amazing program that they've been running for a year or two now. So Stevie, can you just quickly define what weatherization is?
Yeah, I consider weatherization as tightening your home, sealing it so that the air conditioning or the heat that you're using in your home is not leaked out through the envelope of your home. So it's all the opportunities of keeping that that air conditioning and heat inside and being efficient with it. And that can take the place of sealing, around your windows, around your doors. It can take the approach of insulation in your attic and those sorts of things. But weatherization and weatherizing is just all those efforts that can help keep the energy that you use from leaking out of the envelope.
Great, thank you. So I thought we could move on to talking about some of those projects that either the city identified in the adaptation plan, the climate change adaptation plan, or that have kind of come up as an opportunity to adapt to and or mitigate climate change in the city. I know there's been a couple of projects that that you've implemented since then, and maybe you can mention a couple of them to us.
Yeah, so climate adaptation projects that we've done. Well, two that I'm really proud of that I could think of is the Boulevard of the Arts and the Bayfront. There was a dilapidated seawall, and like I was mentioning earlier, we were just as a city, we were just going to replace the seawall. It was just going to be a replacement, but we know that seawalls have negative environmental impacts in terms of wave deflection and not creating a lot of habitat and that sort of thing. And so we assessed the site, and instead of just replacing with a traditional seawall, we did kind of a hybrid riprap solution that was softer, and we did some plantings, and that created the opportunity for more habitat there for wildlife, and also to more naturally deflect wave energy as it came onto the bay. And that was one of our most vulnerable shoreline stretches right there. And it so happens that it's right in the middle of the amazing bay project that is going on and doing so much upgrades to sustainability and environmental preservation on that site. And so that's there might be some changes in the future for that site, but not replacing the seawall. And it was less expensive to go that route. And I think that was for our site was like, wow, we can replace it with a more environmentally friendly solution, and it costs less money and it makes us more climate resilient. It was kind of an obvious thing. Another one that happened earlier was the living seawall, which was for a site that was assessed and deemed would not support a traditional living seawall, or a living shoreline because of the wave energy there and how it worked. So a traditional seawall was put up, but the city wanted to explore ways to maybe make that seawall more environmentally friendly. So there was a local business that had an idea, the Reef Innovations and the Reef Ball Foundation, to put what I would describe as kind of habitat modules in front of the seawall, and kind of put fake tide pools and then reef balls underneath. And it just gave texture to the seawall so that fish could hide and grow, and birds could come and land on it and pick in it. And that one has been really interesting and successful, I think, so far, although Mote Marine Laboratory is studying the site for us. They'll be done in October of this year, so we can really understand how it performed over time. But those are two detailed projects, but those are kind of ways we've done some shoreline adaptation type projects. And then our wastewater, I just got a list from our wastewater department on some of their resiliency projects, and they just upgraded some of the wastewater treatment processing to better take peak flows for extreme rain events, which we know are just going to increase in the future with climate change. And, that was, it increased their capacity and allows them to better deal with any potential saltwater intrusion issues. And that was like a $6 million, upgrade. Wow. So they have some lift stations where they've raised the electrical, and our new lift station 87, which is a huge capital $45 million project. Right. That has taken some really extreme armoring and consideration for storm surge and future sea level rise as well, so it can be resilient.
Great. Yeah, I remember back in Hurricane Irma that some of the lift stations, I think there were a couple in the city that got flooded, so the electricity wasn't working anymore. So they were unable to pump the sewage. So, making those kind of upgrades is so critical for bay health as well.
It's huge. And another thing that they've done since then is invested in more backup generators.
Good. Yeah.
Of those. So kind of raising electrical where you can, having backup generators. And then a real struggle actually with storms in our sewage system can be tree roots, and how you, sometimes that a little more difficult to deal with, but there are some things you can try to mitigate with generators and changing electrical and just armoring systems. So, yeah.
Great, Stevie. Well, we're coming up on, actually, we're past a half an hour at this point. So I want to give you a chance to mention any programs that you're working on now that are really important to you that you want to get out there, or say any last comments. And audience, this is the last chance for questions.
Oh man, I should have prepared this one better. I feel like this is my moment to say something really profound. But one thing I just wanted to mention that I'm really proud of is our community Canopy program, which gives away free trees for private residents. And they're 1 gallon, they're small trees, but we've given away over 800 free trees, and they're delivered directly to the doorsteps of homes and throughout the city. We do it twice a year. We just finished our spring one, and we will do another one hopefully in the fall. And whether it's through that program or not, I really am a deep believer that trees could solve a lot of our problems, whether it's stormwater or flooding or climate, air quality, energy conservation. I mean, just placemaking, all those different things. So I definitely just want to shout out to the tree issue of planting as many trees as we can. And also want to call out the support that we do to Sunshine Community Compost for food waste recovery in some of our city parks. It's really run through Tracy Troxler and Sunshine Community Compost, but it's a great program, and she does a lot of other programs. So for those that may be interested in composting more or food scrap collection, I'd recommend them check out Sunshine Community Compost as well. And then one more, now that I think of it, the Gulf Coast Community Foundation of Sarasota County, Baranza Foundation, all have supported, I'm probably missing some partners in there, UFIFIS, Sarasota County, have all supported a project that I'm really proud of called Partners for Green Places, where we have provided funds to do energy audits for our local nonprofits, and then additional funds to actually do energy saving upgrades for nonprofit facilities. And that's a really great project as well. And just super thankful for the collaboration of all those stakeholders. And it's hopefully going to grow into even more. And that's just one aspect as well that I didn't mention earlier of how we're trying to find ways to address low-income housing, energy upgrades, and then nonprofits have a lot of barriers to investing in energy efficiency for their facilities too. So that's just another way to try to address that. So those are a few programs I wanted to call out, but all in all, I just really appreciate you having me on and being able to talk about some of these initiatives. And I miss working with you here in Portland.
I know. We could keep talking here. And any of those initiatives you just mentioned, we could go on for at least a half an hour about each of those.
I know. We have to have Jeff on. He can talk more about the greenhouse gas.
That's true. That would be great. So, Stevie, thank you so much for joining me. This was it's so good to see you and to talk with you about these initiatives. And you do so much great work with the city, and you can see all your fans in the comment box that are saying the same thing. So make sure you scroll through those afterwards.
Oh, I will.
So before we end the broadcast, I want to ask you the question I've been asking all of our guests, which is, do you have a favorite part of Sarasota Bay or a favorite place you like to go and look at the bay?
Oh, mine would probably be Ken Thompson Park, because I love going over the bridge, going to Ken Thompson Park and looking back towards the city. And that view of the bridge with the city in the background. And I love that it has the boardwalk through the mangroves. My kids love checking out the crabs at low tide there. And beautiful, beautiful spot. So that's probably where I would choose. And
good choice.
Yeah, it's a good one. But
great. Well, Stevie, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you to the audience for seeing us today. We're gonna put some of these resources that we mentioned in the comments on this video so that you can find them later easily, save you some Googling. And so with that, I want to mention that we are going to be back here on Thursday at 1 p.m. with Dr. Randy Wells. He is the director of the Sarasota Dolphin Research Program. So if you are a dolphin fan, if you want to learn more about this really long-running dolphin research program in Sarasota Bay, please do join us on Thursday. So thanks again to the audience. Thanks again, Stevie, and hope we see you all on Thursday. Bye-bye.
Thank you.